The Seahawks 2024 offseason has been a wild one so far, with so many moving pieces from coaching staff to players to restructures to where everything's going on. The backup quarterback's different. The safety room is completely different. The linebacking room is different. I want to break down where the roster currently sits and talk about the coaching staff a little bit. I've come on here almost every day, but I haven't really talked about the new signing of the linebackers and some of the other veteran pieces we brought on. But before I get to those, I wanted to break down everything that's happened. New head coach, Mike Macdonald. New OC, Ryan Grubb. New assistant head coach in Leslie Frazier. New offensive line head coach in Scott Huff. New DC in Aiden Dirty. All of that has changed. So the entire coaching staff in general has been a complete revamp, which means everything's going to be new. When that happens, when the whole building gets changed, other than the GM who, deserved to keep his job, you're going to have so much going on. We had a restructured contracts of Tyler Lockett, D. Eskridge, and Darrell Taylor. We traded for Sam Howell, the quarterback position. And who left the Seahawks was Drew Lock, Damian Lewis, Jordan Brooks, Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, Will Dissly, Colby Parkinson, Devin Bush, Bobby Wagner, DJ Dallas, Nick Ballore, and Brian Monet. I just named all those guys who have been pieces for the Seahawks that have been, a few years now, and pieces that we have tried to build a championship contender around. Even though it didn't work out, they were important pieces to who we were. Will Dissly, Quandre Diggs, Bobby Wagner, Damian Lewis, the Jordan Brooks of the world, Nick Ballore, Brian Monet. This was no joke of a releases and people that have signed elsewhere. It was no joke of the revamp that happened with the Seahawks roster. Now, who did we sign is the big thing. We obviously brought in Leonard Williams back, obviously. Noah Fant was re-signed. We brought in tight end Pharaoh Brown. We brought in Tyrell Dotson at linebacker. We brought in Jerome Baker, Rayshawn Jenkins, George Fant, Nick Harris. Artie Burns came back as well. Now, some of the biggest moves that I want to talk about starting is the linebackers. The Seahawks obviously got Jerome Baker. Now, it's very interesting because, the Seahawks did feel like they probably could have been able to bring back Jordan Brooks on the contract that he had and Bobby Wagner on the contract that he had, but they chose not to. And they chose to sign one-year deals with both Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dotson. And I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today with the guys we brought in was it's a lot of one-year rentals. It's a lot of can you prove it contracts. And I find it really interesting because you do have a coach in Mike Macdonald who took a guy like Patrick Queen, who was looking like a, bust is what a lot of people wanted to call him. He looked like a bust. Made him an all-pro, got a big contract with the Steelers. A lot of people thought we might want to bring him to the Seahawks, but that just didn't happen. And when you have a coach like that, he might believe that he can take these defensive players and take them to the next level. And those one-year rentals become a guy that gets brought back in the next year for a decent price. And now you have a really good football player that you developed into the right, place. The Seahawks brought in Jerome Baker on the one-year deal. He was in coverage at a 74.4, which was top 30 for linebackers in the NFL. He was somewhere near the top 10, I believe. The reason they brought in a guy like Jerome Baker, who's better in coverage, the Seahawks were god-awful in coverage last year. With Jordan Brooks, with Bobby Wagner, they were both in almost in the worst bottom half of coverage for linebackers. So when you bring in a guy like Jerome Baker, you're hoping that one, he has the upside. Two, he can be Jordan Brooks with better coverage. I think those are the simple facts is more upside potentially right now for the price is the better way to put it. Plus a Jordan Brooks with better coverage. And then they went and got Tyrell Dotson 1 year as well. See what we can do with him. With Dotson, he was also rated the number one PFF defender for all linebackers. PFF defense grades, a 90.2. It's ahead of Fred Warner. It's ahead of guys like C.J. Mosley. It's ahead of guys like whoever you want to bring up. I mean, he was number one on PFF for all linebackers in the NFL. 16 games. He had a 90.2 defensive grade. In the rush defense, he had an 86.1. And coverage at 88.4. Very good coverage grade. He was a little lower on tackling at a 54.7. It's like by far his worst category. Pass rush at a 72.8. Maybe we lose a little bit of pass rush because Jordan Brooks was good in the pass rush. But coverage, again, was high. I think the way the Seahawks looked at it and the way that, Mike McDonald and John Schneider look at it is saying, maybe we can replace Wagner and Brooks for a cheaper price, try it out, and have guys that are automatically, most likely, going to be better in coverage and make our defense better. Just like that. If that coverage grade just goes up a little bit, our defense was going to be much better overnight. So those were the moves that I think were the most important of these last few weeks. The Seahawks continued to make moves and a lot of veteran signings. They brought in defensive tackle Jonathan Hankins. He had 27 tackles, 3 sacks, and 14 games with the Cowboys in 2023. Buff up the interior, I guess. I mean, they're looking to find veterans to buff up the defense. They also did it by bringing in, I want to say it right, Tremaine Ankrum, guard from the Rams. I'm not saying that he's not going to play every day, but we have had a lot of injuries the last few years when it comes to our offensive line depth, and I think it's just another depth piece that they're trying their best to find a way to beef it up. Now, the 2 signings from yesterday that I really liked were Kayvon Wallace and Jonathan Hankins, because Jonathan Hankins can beef up the defensive line. He can be a guy that comes in spots, in different spots and cause some havoc. He's a big guy. He's a veteran. And then defensive back, Kayvon Wallace, per PFF, ranked 21st out of 61 qualified safeties with a 70.7 coverage grade. Obviously, the entire purpose, he bounced around from the Cardinals and Titans last year, but the entire purpose was he was good in coverage, and that will allow the Seahawks to have the ability to add some more depth to the corner position. And that brings us to the entire depth chart right now, right? I'm not going to break down everybody. I'm not going to talk about what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th corner and Lance Boykin. Okay. I'm going to talk about the guys that I think that are going to play, but let's go through some of the depth chart and see where the Seahawks roster sits. At quarterback, of course, you have Geno Smith and Sam Howell. At running back, we have Ken Walker, Zach Charbonnet, and Kenny McIntosh from last year. At the wide receiver position, DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyler Lockett, Jake Bobo. Of course, we still have Derek Young and D. Eskridge, Aesop Winston. We have a lot of pieces there. Now at the tight end, Noah Fant, and we brought in Farrell Brown as the backup. With all these moves on the offensive line, this is where the most moves have been made, 3 of them on the offensive line. We still had Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas at tackle. We know there is injury concern sometimes with Abraham Lucas, especially recently. They brought in George Fant to try to ease the pain a little bit on the injuries that can happen at the tackle position. We still have Stone Forsythe. I can always have trouble saying it. But having George Fant there is an extremely important piece because George Fant was actually way better than you guys would think the last 2 years. So to have George Fant there in case Abraham Lucas or somebody like Charles Cross gets hurt is a big deal and a big piece to bring in. At the guard position, we had Anthony Bradford, who was not very good last year. We brought Tremaine Ankrum in, but he is also probably in the same, close to, he's a depth piece. He's not great either, but we have to beef up that position. We have to make some, an attempt to make it really good. I have a strong feeling there's going to be some type of guard drafted in the draft. That might be something we do early in the draft. That might be one of our most important pieces. And at the center position, they brought in Nick Harris as well, who also played fullback. But he looks like right now, I'm guessing behind Olusegun Oluwatimi on the depth chart. That's a very important position. That was actually really interesting. Last year when the draft was going down, I made a video about Olusegun Oluwatimi. Alu. It's an easier way to say it. I think it's my most watched video on YouTube, 36,000 views. If you want to know about that position, and I think because Evan Brown went to the Cardinals, I think this is Alu's job, and they just brought in Nick Harris as a backup. Alu maybe he was disappointing last year to some people, and that's why I didn't get the job, but I think they developed him. He was one of the best centers in all football in college, and that I thought that was a phenomenal draft pick last year, and I think they believe that again, and they're going to start him. I'll link the video, or I'll put it in the description too, but go watch that if you want to know more about him. The other interesting thing about him is he's a Michigan guy. Obviously, Mike McDonald is a Michigan guy also. Maybe he knows more about him. I think it's extremely interesting to see what goes on there. Jason Myers is the kicker. Defensive end, Draymond Jones, Miles Adam, Mike Morris. Mike Morris is another guy from last year's draft that I made a video on. I'll put it in the description if you want to check out these guys. Last year's draft pieces, don't sleep on them. The Derek Halls, the Mike Morris guys, Olusegun, the guys that you don't hear about a lot. Jarek Reed will be back. We've heard about him, but a lot of the guys that we didn't talk about, like this year, I'm thinking you're going to hear about him next year. Defensive tackle, we brought Leonard Williams back. We have Jaron Reed and Cameron Young. Middle linebackers pretty much will be Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dotson. Those were important pieces, like I said, to bring in. I like what we did there, replacing Bobby Wagner and Jordan Brooks. I still believe we probably could have ran it back and it'll be very similar, but I think they found Baker and Dotson at better prices and kept it going. Uchenna Nwasu at the edge with Boye Mafe, Darrell Taylor, and Derek Hall. All that is starting to boost up some depth, and I like where that position is going. At corner, we have a lot of depth too. Tariq Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, Mike Jackson, Trey Bound, Kobe Bryant, and Artie Burns. It's looking deep. Free safety and strong safety. Now, this is very interesting. I think there's 4 guys at the safety position that matter. And that's the rest of the roster on the top out. We have punter. We know it's Dixon. The safety position. Bringing in Rayshawn Jenkins and Kayvon Wallace to add to Julian Love and Jarek Reed. And you have to remember, John Schneider said there's going to be more of a blur when it comes to free versus strong safety in Seattle. Jenkins and Wallace both play some as free safety as well as in the box/slot in McDonald's scheme. So 4 safeties in general, everything can move around. Forget where it's free or strong safety. It's Julian Love, Rayshawn Jenkins, Jarek Reed, and Kayvon Wallace. So the Seahawks made a lot of these moves, and I think the roster's really shaped up as a decent roster as a whole. It's not a Super Bowl roster today. That's totally fine. But it's shaped up as a very decent roster as a whole. And I think the interesting piece here is you're going to see a lot of those young guys play more. Like I mentioned, Olusegun. You're going to have guys like, the Derek Hall and Uchenna Nwasu and Boye Mafe and Requel and Devin Witherspoon, Jarek Reed next year. Mike Morris might get some playing time next year. Cameron Young. There's a lot of young pieces on this team, and then they wanted to mix it in with a lot of one-year deals on linebackers like Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dotson, like Pharaoh Brown as a backup tight end, the second tight end. I don't like to say backup. Some guard play, some safety play, and test out these markets, see what they do in the draft this year, and then figure it out next year moving forward of what are those final pieces, who are the final guys we need to make that Super Bowl run. I love where they're doing this. I love the way they're doing it. I love the moves they've been making. So I'm excited to see where the rest of the team goes. How do you feel about how the entire roster is currently shaped up for the Seattle Seahawks? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back probably tomorrow for another one. Peace.